All right, let's dive into a really crucial piece of legislation that completely changed the game for British rule in India, Pitt's India Act of 1784. Now, if you're gearing up for the UPSC exams, you know this is a big one. It's a major turning point, and understanding it is absolutely key.
And that really brings us to the central mystery here, doesn't it? How on earth did a massive trading corporation, the East India Company, end up basically handing over the keys to an empire to the British government? Well, the answer to that is all wrapped up in the crisis that made this act not just a good idea, but an absolute necessity.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the absolute mess the company was in. Then, we'll see how Parliament stepped in with a major power play. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the Act itself, unpack that unique dual control system, and finally, weigh its legacy, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Okay, first up, the company in crisis. You've got to understand, the Pitt's India Act didn't just pop up out of thin air. Nope. It was a direct reaction to a whole series of disasters that were getting so bad, the government back in London just couldn't look away anymore. I mean, just look at this. It was a perfect storm of problems. The first attempt to fix things, the Regulating Act of 1773, was a total flop. The company was bleeding money. They were even losing on the battlefield, like in the First Anglo-Maratha War. And on top of all that, you had staggering levels of corruption. The bottom line was, a company built for trade was trying to govern a massive empire, and the whole thing was falling apart. And all that chaos, well, it forced Parliament's hand, which leads us to our next section. The power play. The British government, led by the young Prime Minister William Pitt, realized that just trying to regulate the company from afar wasn't going to cut it. It was time for a direct intervention.
And wow, this single quote tells you everything you need to know about how big this power play was. Just a simple change in words, but it was revolutionary. It wasn't the company's territories anymore. For the first time, they were officially called the British possessions in India. This was the Crown planting its flag loud and clear.
So how did they actually do it? Let's get into the key provisions of the Act. This is the how of the story, the actual nuts and bolts of the new system designed to put the company on a leash held by the state. The centerpiece of the whole thing was this new body, the Board of Control. You can think of it as the government's official watchdog. It was made up of top officials appointed by the Crown, and their job was to oversee everything: civil affairs, military operations, revenue collection, basically all the parts of governing. They could see all the company's mail and had to sign off on every important order.
The Act also did some major housekeeping within India itself. Before this, the governments in Bombay and Madras kind of did their own thing, which caused a lot of headaches. This provision put an end to that. It clearly made them subordinate to the big boss, the Governor-General in Bengal, creating a much stronger, centralized chain of command. And remember that out-of-control corruption? Well, the Act took a swing at that, too. From now on, officials had to declare everything they owned, both in India and back in Britain. This made it way harder to hide dirty money. And if you got caught, the punishments were severe. The message was clear: the party's over. Now we get to maybe the most famous and, let's be honest, kind of confusing part of the Act, the system of dual control. This was this clever idea of creating a double government, trying to draw a clean line between the company's business and the actual politics of running a country.
This breaks it down perfectly. The company, through its court of directors, got to keep doing what it was originally created for: managing trade, ships, and all that commercial stuff. But everything else, the politics, the army, the taxes, basically the entire job of governing, was now firmly under the watch of the Crown's Board of Control. It was a simple formula. The company could propose, but the Crown would dispose.
So that was the power structure set up in London, but to make this whole top-down system actually work on the ground in India, the government needed someone with real authority to get things done. And they achieved this with what looks like a tiny administrative change, but it had a massive impact. They cut the number of members in the Governor-General's Council from 4 down to just 3. And here's why that little number change was such a game changer. With only 3 council members, the Governor-General now had a casting vote. He only needed one other person to agree with him to get anything passed. This completely broke the gridlock that had paralyzed governors in the past and gave him the power to act decisively, making sure the orders coming from that Board of Control in London were actually carried out. So, the new system is in place. But did it work? What was the lasting impact? Let's move on and really analyze the legacy of this act, looking at both why it was so significant and where it really fell short. In terms of significance, this act was huge. There's no other way to put it.
It cemented the British government's ultimate control over India, period. It put the official stamp of British possessions on the map. It turned the once mighty company into basically a subordinate department of the state and created a much more streamlined, centralized government in India.
But, and this is a big but, it was far from a perfect solution. That whole dual control system, it actually made things pretty murky. Who was really in charge? The lines were often blurry, which meant corruption and power abuses didn't just vanish. And most importantly, the entire system was designed for one purpose: to benefit Britain. The interests and well-being of the Indian people barely factored in at all.
So if you take away just one thing, it should be this. Pitt's India Act of 1784 was the moment the mask well and truly came off. It was the formal, fundamental shift of power from a private company to the British state. It was the legal foundation that defined British imperial rule for the next 70 years.
Which leaves us with one final big question to chew on. Was this act a genuine attempt to reform a corrupt, broken system, or was it just a very clever way to put a legal stamp of approval on Britain's ever-growing imperial ambitions? It's something we're thinking about. Thanks so much for joining me.